All right. Open to John 15 if you have your Bible of any kind, electronic or otherwise. I was thinking, I prefer, even if it's like this kind of thing, I prefer electronic. It's so easy to navigate, but there's just something about that book feel. I just use a different version now, so I need to get an ESV paper Bible. So open to John 15. The setting here is a continuation of what Mike taught us last week, right? In the middle of chapter 13, Jesus is starting what's known as a farewell discourse by, that's kind of a label that Bible scholars have put to it. It's when they're in the last hours that they're going to be with Jesus. They spent some time talking. Jesus has announced that someone's going to betray him. Judas has left the building, and then he begins talking to them about where he's going and what's going to happen. And they're asking questions, and they're freaked out. And these last, as Mike pointed out, these last few chapters 13 through 17, are like just zoomed in on everything that Jesus is saying to them in these final hours. And it's a very small, intimate setting. It's just them. And he's talking a lot, and they're afraid, they're scared. But that's who's there. There's not he's not speaking to a group of people, unbelievers and believers mixed, believers in him. He's speaking just to his disciples. And in chapter 14, the discussion's been centering around Jesus leaving and Jesus coming back, mostly, with a few other things like the promise of the Holy Spirit. And they're asking, how do we know where you're going? And he says, I'm the way. And Mike taught us about that last week. And then he says, and I'm coming back too. And he says, we're going to have the Spirit while I'm away. And then we'll all be together. And he's talking about all this, these places. He says, I'm going to prepare a place for you. In my house, in my Father's house, there are many rooms. I'm going to go prepare a place. And then later, when he's talking about his return, he says, I'll come back, and the Father and I will make a home in you. But now in chapter 15, he starts talking not so much about the places of dwelling, but about the dwelling itself, the act of dwelling. The living, the word that it's kind of not a common word nowadays, except in this setting, not a common word in English, regular speech, but abiding, right? An abode is a home. Abiding means to live there, right? But we don't use that word much anymore, and it's a suitable translation, but we'll get to that in a minute about everything else that's in there. So let's. Are you there at John 15? A couple of you are. If you don't have a Bible with you, that'll be up here. You can always look over the shoulder of somebody, and if you don't have a Bible at all, we'll get you one. Just let us know. So John 15. Let's start in verse 1. This is the last of the 7 I am statements in the book of John. I am the true vine. Let's stop right there. Just notice that word true. That'll be important later. He didn't say I'm the vine or a vine. He said I'm the true vine. And my Father is the vine dresser. Vine dresser here means like a farmer. It's a generic word for farmer, since he's talking about vines here. He's talking about a farmer that takes care of vines, a husbandman, a culturist, horticulture. And so it includes the word dressing. I always think of, tying things together or putting things. It's not just that. It's the soil. It's everything that somebody would do to take care of this plant. And he says, the Father is the vine dresser. Verse 2, every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already verse 3, already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. So I want you to know that the word prune there and the word clean are from the same root. You could say, and I think some translations do say, I didn't look it up, but I kind of have some kind of memory of this. That you could say, every branch that does bear fruit, he cleans, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean, and prune is a good translation because clean. It's not like we're not talking about washing off the dirt, putting some soap on there or anything like that, blowing it off. But it's clean. And if there's dead branches or branches that are don't have grapes on them or aren't, they're kind of trying to make it, but they're not making it. You want the growth of the branch to go here and the nutrients to be spent here to create something and not in these other places. And that's what pruning does, right? And so Jesus is saying that when we bear fruit, these branches, when they bear fruit, they get pruned, but it's a good thing because that'll enables them to bear more fruit. And then he also says, you're already pruned, you're already clean by the word that I've spoken to you. Word there is logos. So logos is the expression of a thought. We think written word. It doesn't necessarily mean written word. It's the expression of a thought, a message, a statement, a speech. In this context, it's Jesus' teachings, right? His teaching, my word, his message, his statements, and he's saying you're already clean because of this word. And then, verse 4, he says, "Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me." And it's a little bit of a curious phrase to use about vines, but obviously Jesus is, there's a metaphor here. And abide, it means to live, but it means a lot more than that. In fact, you'll see some translations say remain, because remain's a good translation. To stay. To persevere in some cases, to continue on, to endure, right? To live, to not perish, to not leave, right? Not depart. You're going to tarry. You're going to stay a while. It's going to last, right? All those meanings are kind of within that word depending on the context, okay? That's really important. That's really important because the big question, and we're gonna go through some of this week, and the next time, which will be in a few Sundays after Rod and some of the fifth Sunday, things like that. Because the big question is, what does abiding mean to me today? That's like the $1 million question. What is that? How do I do it? How do I know what I'm doing? Right? So it's important to know that it just doesn't mean live in me. Right? It means to remain, to stay, to continue, to endure, to persevere, to tarry. Don't go anywhere. Don't be in a hurry to leave. Right? It's the opposite of leaving. It's staying. It's lasting. So he says that we have to be essentially connected to him. As branches are connected to a vine, we got to be connected to him. He says, "Abide in me and I in you." We're not just remaining with him, but he's remaining in us. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, he says again, and you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Right? Just like a branch couldn't bear fruit if it's not connected to a vine and a root system and all that, it withers and dies, right? How's it going to bear fruit? How could it do anything on its own? He's making a simple point here, but he's really emphasizing all the implications. He doesn't want us to miss this. He doesn't want the disciples to miss this. They're in a small setting. He's explaining it at length. verse 6. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into a fire, and burned. So I wanted to stop here and just take a little bit of time to address that, and it's connected to some of the things he says in verse 2, because it's kind of an uncomfortable word, right? If you think about it. He's talking to believers, his disciples. And he says things like, well, if you don't abide in me, get cut off, taken away, burned. And there's been a lot of debates, based on these verses about eternal security and salvation and all this stuff. And the debates still go on. We're not going to settle it here. But I will say this. That's not the main point. Okay, Jesus is not giving them a metaphor about salvation and whether you can lose it or not. Right? The metaphors, there's this phrase, whether a metaphor has legs, right? A metaphor, you can use it to a certain degree, and it applies to certain things, and after a while, you're like, wait, it doesn't apply, or it might not apply as well, right? And some metaphors go really far, and some not so far. And Jesus' main point here is not a discussion about history of branches. The point is, if you remain in him, he's the source of life. If we stay connected, we got life. If we disconnect, we don't got life. If we refuse to connect, we don't got life. That's his point. And in other places, he's talking about water as that life, right? He talks about the bread as that life. And so the point is, be connected. And let's not be distracted too much by, well, what does that mean? Could I lose my salvation? All these different things that if we go down that path, then it's just, we end up missing the main point. The point is to be connected. The point is to be connected. So verse 7, if you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. Words there is rhema, not logos this time. So rhema is like the living word, the spoken word, right? The dynamic word. It's what he's saying now. So he's saying both, right? You're clean because of the word I've spoken, but you got to continue, right? I've given you a message. It's made an impact in you, but you got to continue hearing my words. You got to continue hearing what I'm saying now, not just what I said then. What I said then is completely applicable. What I said then is true, but you still need to be continuing. You have the things I'm saying now also need to be listened to and accepted and heard and understood and meditated on. My words need to remain, need to abide, need to continue, need to last in you. He says, if you do that, you ask whatever you wish and it'll be done for you. This is probably like at least the third time that Jesus mentions this sort of thing, and he's actually going to mention it a little bit later in verse 16. In chapter 14, he says that if we ask whatever we want, that he'll do it for us, and that the Father will be glorified if we ask in his name. And he says that a couple times in chapter 14. In chapter 16, later he returns to that, and he says that you haven't asked of me anything yet, but if you do, right? So this is something. These are points that Jesus is emphasizing several times during his talking to them, and it's all connected to if we're connected. He's saying if we're in relationship, if you're abiding in me and I'm in you, if you're keeping my commandments, if you're keeping my words, then this is one of the products that you'll pray and it'll get answered. They'd never seen Jesus pray ever, and it didn't get answered. Think about that. Sometimes he made a point just Like he stood out in front of, I think it was Lazarus. He said, Lord, and he starts praying, but he says, I know you hear me. I'm not saying it for them. But he everything that he prayed for, he got answers to prayer. And he's saying, when we're in this relationship, you'll get that too. This isn't an exclusive thing, as long as you're connected to me. And so in verse 8, he's kind of starting kind of like an interpretation and application of this metaphor. He's still talking about vines and stuff, but he's shifting a little bit from talking about the metaphor itself to now what's the interpretation, what's the application. Verse 8 says, by this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. Bearing fruit is something that disciples do. It's a proof. It's not something to get the cart before the horse, okay? It's not, you want to prove to me that you're a disciple, or I want to prove to myself that I'm a disciple, I better go out there and get some fruit. That's kind of getting it backwards. It's not about works, in other words, that I need to go out and do these things to kind of prove to myself, to kind of assure myself, or prove to others that I'm a disciple. It's just a byproduct of remaining, a byproduct of abiding, a byproduct of being connected to the vine. Well, you bear fruit. I mean, that's what vines do. That's their nature. And Jesus is saying, when you're connected to me, that's your nature, is to bear fruit. Verse 9, as the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, keep there is to guard, to maintain. Right? You're taking care of this. And the commandments is this word. There's an emphasis in this word. It means command. It means a kind of an order, but the emphasis is on the end objective. Right? So it's not just do it however you want kind of thing, but there's a right way to do it. There's an end objective in sight, the end view in sight. And again, not a new thing. In John 14, three places he talks about, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. He says, keep my words sometimes too. It's his words, his message is his commandments. They're all kind of, it's just different ways of expressing the same thing. What he's asked us to do, what his message is, the lifestyle, the things he's asked us to do. And he says, if you keep my commandments, you'll abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full. So let's go on to verse 12. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. So he's talked about this metaphor. He's explained it a little bit and says, if you keep my commandments, you'll abide in my love. Okay, what's his commandment? He sums it up here. This is a summary. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone laid down his life for his friends. Because Jesus is saying this the night he's arrested, that's looming large in our minds in hindsight, right? Like physically, literally laying down his life. But that was just the last thing Jesus did. He'd been laying down his life since the moment he was born as a baby, because Philippians says that he didn't consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he set it aside, taking on the form of a man. So from that point on, he'd been laying down his life, in other words, his rights, needs, desires, wants, things that his privileges. So what does that mean? Can I lay down my life for someone without actually dying for them, like pushing them out of the way of a steaming locomotive or something? A turnip truck. Yes, I can. I can set aside maybe I have a right to be offended about something, but it doesn't really further what God's doing in my friend. I can set that aside. Maybe I have a right for this thing to be provided to me, but, if I set that aside, that'll enable me to build a platform under somebody to raise them up to what God's called them to do. I mean, we do that with our kids all the time, those of us that are parents, right? That's the point. We're trying to set aside my needs and wants of like a good night's sleep when that little baby's born, right? For them. In Jesus' case, and it can for us certainly include laying down our physical lives. Verse 14, you are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends, for all that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go in my name, that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. These things I command you so that you will love one another. So we're going to talk more about next week about what is abiding, what's the fruit, and friendship with God. But today, I really wanted to dig into vineyards and vines and branches, because I discovered something that just kind of blew my mind and just so changed how I viewed the importance of what Jesus is saying and the importance to me. It's just been so impactful. And I want you to get it. I want you to grasp it. So the first thing is that in the Old Testament, the vineyard metaphor is always used for the people of Israel. The vineyard is the people of Israel. And a lot of times it's used in the Old Testament when things aren't going so well. When God is talking about the fact that they haven't been bearing fruit, that they're not doing what they're supposed to do. That's often when he uses this metaphor in the Old Testament. And it's connected to both the plants. So the vineyard is the vines and the grounds, right? That's the vineyard. So in this metaphor, the people of Israel are the plants, right? And the land is the promised land, Canaan. Right? So when he's talking about my vineyard and what's wrong, why is my vineyard not producing fruit and stuff like that in these prophecies, he's talking about the people of Israel in their land. And what you got to understand, if you don't already, is that the land is of super prime importance to the Israelites, to the Jews, right? Think about it. What was the promise that Abraham got? He said, God said to Abraham, get up, go to a land that I will show you. And he made him promises about, through you all the nations will be blessed. And you'll have multiple descendants. And he says, I'm going to give you this land. The only thing that Abraham saw out of that was one son. The rest, that's why he's the father of faith. Because he had all these promises, and he lived believing all those promises, even though in his lifetime all he saw was one boy. And then Isaac grew up, and he's still living in this land, and he is a stranger, and they're nomads. They're living on, they're setting up on somebody else's land. Hey, can we park our tents here? They have herds and all this stuff, but none of that land is theirs. But Abraham tells his son, you're going to get this land. This is something that God has promised me. It didn't happen in Isaac's time frame. It didn't happen in Jacob's time frame. And then they all go down to Egypt. And they're down there for centuries. But there's still this promise. There's still this promise. And so that's why Hebrews looks back and says, by faith Joseph at the end of his life, spoke about the Exodus and gave directions concerning his bones. And we read that in Exodus, they took Joseph. We read in Exodus they took Joseph's bones with them when they went out of Egypt. Centuries of a promise, starting with a family now built into the psyche of this 3 million Israelites that are marching out of Egypt. They've been promised God is going to be their God. And they've been promised that it's going to happen in this land. And then they go to this land. And that's why God's really upset when they get freaked out about it. And they don't want to go in. But then eventually they do. And in Joshua's, in the book of Joshua, when they've conquered the land, he's divvying it out to everybody. And they divide it into plots, and they cast lots, and each tribe gets plots and all the. It was so important that women who didn't normally inherit property, there was this one line that didn't have any male heirs there. And the women of that line, they were like, well, this is the promised land. Do we not get anything? And they made an exception for them. It's so important that the year of Jubilee, one of the things that happened, let's say I have a house up in Anna. Let's say, within the next 10 years, I just come on hard times and I need to sell it to a friend to raise some cash. That could happen to an Israelite. He might sell himself into slavery. All kinds of things might happen. It might be famines, might be bugs. Just fall on hard times. You gotta do what you gotta do. But every 50 years, all that reverted back to. That's how important that was. This is my plot. This is my portion, my land, my inheritance in perpetuity. Even if I fall on hard times, I'm going to get it back eventually. Maybe not me, but my kids. And if they fall on hard times, they'll still get it back eventually. It was so important, this promised land. And so the vineyard includes the people and includes the land. Here's a couple examples in the Old Testament. Isaiah 5, the first 7 verses. I'll just read the last verse, but first 7 verses, Jesus, the Lord is talking through Isaiah in the form of a prophecy at length with this vineyard thing. And the last verse says, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. The men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, but behold bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold an outcry." If you read the whole thing, he's upset that they're not doing the right thing. But he's comparing them to a vineyard. Jeremiah 12, "Many shepherds have destroyed my vineyard. They have trampled down my portion. They have made my pleasant portion a desolate wilderness." God's upset at what the leaders have done to his vineyard. It's his portion, his land. And Jesus, he uses the vineyard metaphor in much the same way. Like in the Synoptics, he tells parables about, he talks about this vineyard that has a fig tree in it, and the fig tree isn't bearing fruit, and what to do about it, right? There's one, it's known as the parable of the tenants, where he tells this parable where he says, there's this vineyard that this man built, right? He planted the plants. He built a fence around it, protect it from animals and things trying to get in there and steal the grapes. He dug a wine press. He built a tower. He fixed it up nice. Then he leased it out and went away. And then when the time comes for the fruit to be collected, he sends a servant to the tenants to get the fruit. And they ridicule this servant, send him away. So he sends another one. Well, this time they beat him up and send him away. He sends another servant. This time, they beat him up and they kill him. The owner doesn't hear from that servant again. And he keeps sending servants. Some they kill, some they beat up. And then he sent the owner of the vineyard says, "I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to send my son. He's my son. They'll respect him. And he sends his son. And these tenants go, oh, he's the heir. Like if we kill him, we'll cut off the family line. And so they kill him. And Jesus is telling a metaphor about the land of Israel as the vineyard, the tenants as the leaders that are corrupt, the servants that he's sending are the prophets to admonish them. And they don't do it. They don't pay attention. Finally, he sends his son. That's Jesus. And Jesus says at the end of this parable, he says, what do you think is going to happen next after they killed the son? And they say, let me read it to you here. They say, yeah, he's going to go there. He's going to put those wretches to death. And he'll lease that out to somebody else who's going to actually give him the fruit of it. And Jesus says, yeah, that's what he'd do. And he adds this on. He says, yeah, have you never read the scriptures? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to people producing its fruits. So I'm connecting this morning. I'm going to be connecting several dots for us, pulling this thread here, because it's what's needed, I think, to kind of get this. The land, the vineyard. But what does Jesus say in John 15? He kind of changes that drastically. He says, I'm the vine, you're the branches. Before it's, okay, the vineyard, the plants are the people, right? And they're in this land. But Jesus now says, no, that's not what it's about. It's, you're just branches. I'm the vine. I'm the true vine. And he's saying, you're not automatically part of God's people just because you're dwelling in this land. It's about whether or not you're connected to me. Whether you're connected to me is what matters. You don't just fall into this by how you were born or where you were born. It's a big thing. It's subtle, but it's a big thing. It's not about the location of the vineyard. It's about whether they're connected to the vine. This whole time, they know. They've heard these scriptures, right? They know that the vineyard is God's people. And Jesus says, no, that's not how it is. It's different now. So here's the thing. Jesus replaced, we know this, Jesus replaced the religious functions of the temple, yeah? We don't do sacrifices anymore. We don't have a priest. Hebrews especially talks at length about how he is our high priest, and he is our atoning sacrifice. The priest performs a sacrifice. The sacrifice takes away the sin. The priest also intercedes on behalf of the people. That's all fulfilled by Jesus. We don't need to go to Jerusalem to do sacrifices anymore. We need to have a priest sprinkle blood on us. But the other thing that happened, equally important, but maybe less meditated on, that Jesus also replaces the religious inheritance of the land. Jesus is now our high priest. Jesus is now our atoning sacrifice. And Jesus is now our promised land. The focus, the focal point of God's habitation is all in Jesus. He's the true vine. And it's just as it's so important that we appropriate his work for us as high priest, that it says that he lives ever to intercede for us. and his atoning sacrifice, it's also important that we dwell, abide, remain, continue, and last in him. Now it's a spiritual land. And sometimes you have trouble connecting that with that because we're not Jewish, right? We don't have this history of all these sacrifices and this history of this promised land. But I think by and large, the church, and I'm speaking a little more globally, but I'm including ourselves, I'm including myself, by and large have been easier, or I've done this longer to understand and relate the things about the sacrifice and the priest. But not so much have I understood what Jesus was saying about the land. Jesus is replacing. Says that sacrifices? No, that's me. That priest? No, that's me. That promised land? No, that's me too. It's all there. All arrows point to Jesus. That's so important. And this doesn't go against what the Old Testament says. It kind of actually brings it into focus. In the Old Testament, the Levites, they were the ones that had to take care of the tabernacle. They'd carry the ark and stuff like that. They'd take it down and set it back up. And they didn't get any land. All the other tribes had some land in the promised land. They didn't get any land. And because it says, and this is in Deuteronomy, that God is their portion. He's their inheritance. Their land is God. Same thing with the priests, the Aaronic priesthood. It's in Numbers 18, I think. What the priests get, my portion, my inheritance. They don't get inheritance either. The Aaronic priests were also Levites, but they have even more responsibility, and they get God as their portion and their inheritance. They get a spiritual inheritance. Jesus is bringing that into focus for us today, and now in this new covenant. I read Jeremiah 12. Many shepherds have destroyed my vineyard. They have trampled down my portion. Right? Another place where God is saying, the people are my inheritance. Because that's the other thing. It's not just that the Levites and the priests get their inheritance in God. But God says, my promised land, what I want to do, the land I'm looking for, is the people. That's a really good point. Deuteronomy 32:9, but the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. It's what he is after, is to live in us. That's what he's risked everything for, sacrificed everything for. And it was back then, but it was the older covenant. It was different, but it was still there. It was still a spiritual home. And in Hebrews, they make this point that even back then, right? Hebrews 11, the fathers of faith. Let me just read this to you. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called out to go to a place that he was going to receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. Okay, so far that sounds like what we've heard. But then he says this, for he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. And later in Hebrews, he says, he's talking about the patriarchs, they all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. See, even though they didn't inherit the physical land, the writer of Hebrews is saying, yeah, but that really wasn't what it's about. It's about a spiritual home. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they'd gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. He's prepared a city. Jesus said, I go to prepare a place for you. And when I come back, the Father and I will make our home in you. Do you get it, church? The land, the inheritance. What we get is God. What God gets is us. That's what he wanted out of this. He didn't want people to worship him. That wasn't the driving thing. I want people to worship that will worship me. I want people that will obey me. That's not the driving thing. The driving thing is he wanted to have fellowship with somebody else that wanted it too, that wasn't doing it because he made them. So John is talking about this before, right? He says that the Word became flesh and tabernacled amongst us. Jesus, and when he's talking about the temple in chapter 2, he says, I'm the temple. If you destroy this temple in 3 days, I could rebuild it in 3 days. But they realized later he's talking about himself. The focal point of where heaven and earth meet is in Jesus, right? So this isn't something that John hasn't talked about. This isn't something that the Old Testament hasn't talked about, but it's coming into focus. And in chapter 15, it's the most profound theological relocation of the holy space. It gets real. It's not before it was the land of Israel, and within that Jerusalem, and within that the temple. And now it's Jesus. He's the true vine. He's the true vine. He's the only way. No one comes to the Father except through him. If you don't abide in the vine, you're not going to be able to abide in some other plant and get there. It's all or nothing. Jesus. Paul, one more for you. Like I said, I'm connecting these dots, bringing this all together, this thread. It's all there. It's in the Old Testament. It's not anything that's like, oh, this is something Jesus just, completely changed, made up or anything. It's all been there. The scriptures point to this all along, as in so many other things. They're a story. The whole scriptures are a story about Jesus. And it's coming to this point when Jesus is born and dies for us. So Paul, in Romans 11, he used kind of a combo of the parable of the tenants. Probably it sounds like to me. It's just reading what he's doing here. He's pulling concepts from like the parable of the tenants, pulling concepts from like the true vine, and that Jesus teaching on the true vine, and he's applying them to like the salvation history. Much of Romans is Paul kind of telling the history of salvation, how it started with the Israelites and all the different things, right? And in this part, he uses he's not using a vine metaphor, he's using an olive tree metaphor. And there's this olive tree that's a cultivated, like a domestic olive tree, let's say. And it has a root that sustains it, and that's its source. But then there's these wild olive branches that get grafted into the cultivated olive. The branches are the Israelites. The root is Jesus. The wild branches that get grafted in, but now they're part of it. That's any of us that are not Jewish heritage. And he's painting this picture, and he's saying the same thing. The root, these wild branches are getting grafted in, and they're getting the same nourishment, it says in Romans 11, that from the root, just like the rest of the cultivated part of the tree is the and he says this. He talks about some branches that were broken off due to unbelief. It's the Jews that didn't believe Jesus, right? When Paul's writing this, there's a lot of Jews that believed and a lot that didn't. And he says some of the, just like Jesus is talking about in his statements on being the true vine, that if you don't abide in him and remain in him, you die, you get broken off. Paul talks about the same thing. There's Jews that have been rejecting Jesus. They've died, they've broken off. And he says this in verse 22 of Romans 11. Note then, and really, I really want you to catch this. Note then the kindness and severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen. The branches that rejected him. But God's kindness to you, he's talking to Gentiles, provided you continue in his kindness. Let me read that again. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity towards those who have fallen, but kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. What do you think the word continue is in Greek? Say it louder, please. Abide. Remember, I said it means remain, last, endure, continue in, live, tarry, don't go away, persevere. That's kind of the meaning, and the context determines the word they picked in English. Provided that you abide in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even they, now he's talking about the branches that were cut off, the Jews that have rejected Jesus. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, and even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted back in. It's not necessarily a permanent state. They'll be grafted back in, for God has the power to graft them back in again. Amen. And I'll give you one guess. If they do not continue in their unbelief, what's the Greek in continue? Abide. So, he says, God's kindness towards you provided you abide in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue to abide, if they do not still abide in their unbelief, they'll be grafted back in, because God has the power to do that. So what? I hope you're getting some of the so what as we've been talking. Abiding in him is vital. Remaining, staying, continuing in him is vital. He provided himself for our dwelling place. And it's just as important as his function of atoning sacrifice for our sins, as his function as a priestly intercessor for us. Just as important is the fact that he's provided a dwelling place. And the thing is, the metaphor of the promised land has a lot of legs. Oh my gosh, does it have a lot of legs, right? It's used appropriately in so many ways. But one thing that we've done kind of is related it to heaven, the sweet by and by, mostly. And we say that now we're in the desert, but then we'll be in the promised land. But Jesus is saying, I'll come to you and I'll make my home in you. I'm sending the Holy Spirit. And he's saying, you can already do this. I've pruned you, I've cleaned you. Abide in my love. I'll abide in you. You'll abide in me. We'll abide together. You're my portion. I'm your portion. You're my inheritance. I'm your inheritance. And it starts now. but my question is, have we realized how important that is, just at the same level of sacrifice for our sins? If I sin, I get forgiveness. If I pray something stupid, the Spirit intercedes for me and says, what he meant was this. I'm like, oh, thank you. But probably so many of my prayers would are in that category. Just like that. Just those are important. Do you feel that are you grateful? Yeah, right? For that sacrifice, for that priestly role. But just as important, just as vital is remaining in him, abiding in him. He is our dwelling place. Everything rises and falls on that after you've settled the sacrifice and priestly questions, right? All of us that are believers, now we have those roles, and now what we got to do? We got to abide. Why? Jesus said, apart from me, you can do nothing. We're pretty useless if we don't remain in him. But the tragedy is that from not understanding the importance, the wiles of the enemy, bad teaching, whatever, we haven't realized how important it is to remain in him. That we can't just say, yeah, okay, I purchased the fire insurance, he's my Savior, but he has to be my Lord too. We're going to get into that next week. What does abiding mean to us today? These statements about keeping my commandments, being my friend, bearing fruit. But what I want you to get today is that it's vital. And it's oh so incredible. It's vital that we do it, but it's not a task. Like, it's not like, grr. It's, oh man, I have this great place that I can live in now. And someone to share it with now. And it's Jesus.